Good afternoon, students. Today is Monday, 21 March 2022. This is our first lecture for the week. Remember, I'll be in the classroom on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 8 o'clock until 9:20, but I won't be lecturing since I'm doing that now. What I'll do instead, if anyone shows up, is discuss some of the issues that have arisen in our readings and in my lectures. And you can also ask questions if you have any. Okay? So feel free to take advantage of these videos if you'd like to watch them from the comfort of your home. That's fine. Okay, let's go over the postings. And first of all, I'll remind you that our exam is in 10 days. It's on the 31st of March. Same format as before, 10 true-false questions, 30 multiple choice questions. The exam will be administered on Canvas, and the time period is 8 in the morning until 9:20, which is the time we would ordinarily be in the classroom taking it. All right, back to postings. I've put up a lot of items over the spring break. Many of them are optional, and I mean what I say there. It's permissible for you to read them if you'd like. In fact, I recommend that you do. It's also permissible to ignore them. But I like to think that you're inquisitive and that you'd like to read some of these background materials so that you understand King's letter better. But I won't be asking exam questions on anything that's marked optional reading. So let's go through what I've posted. I begin with the actual letter that King wrote while he was in jail. This is my copy of it. This is the one I posted. There are a lot of versions of this on the internet, but I'm going to be reading from this one and talking about this one. This is a typescript. As you can see, after King wrote his letter in the margins of a newspaper with a pencil that someone had smuggled into him in jail, he gave that newspaper to his colleagues who had come to visit him. They took it and typed it up. This is the typed up version of what King wrote. So it's as close to the original writing as you're going to get, because I doubt that anyone saved the newspaper with the penciled in remarks on it. So I tracked this down years ago, and I like to use this when I teach this letter. Okay, the next item that's posted is what I call an illustrated guide to Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail. And if you've taken a look at that and printed that out, you'll see it's 23 pages long, single-spaced. Now, it's illustrated. What I mean by that is I interspersed images of King and some of the other people involved in his protest, and also other items. So I'm going to be reading over that with you as well. I'll explain the procedure more thoroughly in just a moment. Still looking at the postings, I have posted a timeline of the events of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. It's called Key Dates in the Life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, it would be nice to go over that, but it would just take time that we need to devote to his actual letter. So I'll leave that to you to look over on your own. It starts off with his birth in 1929, and it culminates in his death in 1968. And it was a very event-filled life. King's life, while not long in terms of its duration, was filled with activities. He was an intellectual, he was a man of action, he was a visionary, many things besides. So read over that to familiarize yourself with the main events of King's life. Okay, I also posted a law review article written by a law professor. The title is Martin Luther King, Walker versus City of Birmingham, and the letter from Birmingham jail. Now, I highly recommend that. It is listed as optional reading, but I do highly recommend it for you. You can skip the footnotes if you'd like. There are a lot of footnotes, but if you just read the text, you will understand more clearly what happened. How did King end up in jail? Why was he in Birmingham to begin with? Those sorts of things. It's a very well-written essay, so I commend it to you, to your attention. The next item that I've posted is what I call a public statement by 8 Alabama clergymen. And I think I'm going to begin by reading that since it's short. King's letter from jail was literally and directly a reply to a statement that had been published in the local newspaper in Birmingham, Alabama, by 8 clergymen of different religious faiths. So think of this as a dialogue. 8 clergymen wrote a statement, which they published. King happened to be in town at the time. They knew that, and that's why they published their statement. King read it from his jail cell, and it prompted him to write his letter in response. And he refers to them repeatedly in his letter as my dear fellow clergymen. So I think in order to understand King's letter, you really do need to read and think about and understand the statement written by the clergyman. The next item is a video that happens to be posted on the internet, and it's by President John F. Kennedy. President Kennedy was elected in November 1960, and of course you know he was assassinated in November 1963, not just a few months after King wrote his famous letter. This speech, this statement that President Kennedy delivered on television was read to the American people on the 11th of June, 1963, just 2 months after King's letter. So a lot of things are happening in 1963. King is arrested and jailed. He writes his famous letter, all of that in April. In June, President Kennedy delivered a national address on television dealing with the events in Birmingham and the civil rights legislation that he wanted to get through Congress and sign into law. And in November, Kennedy was killed, assassinated. In August, King read in Washington, D.C., a speech that he had written entitled, I Have a Dream. And I've posted the text of that famous speech. It's quite short. And notice I do not have that listed as optional reading. I do expect you to read that. I may ask a question or two about it. I then posted an optional reading that describes to you in just a few pages the Civil Rights Act of 1964. After both King and Kennedy had been killed, the Civil Rights Act was pushed through Congress and signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson. And so you need to understand what the Civil Rights Act specifies, what it does. And so I recommend that you read that short article about it. I then posted I call it an obituary, but really it's a news report describing King's assassination in April 1968. Actually, I misspoke a moment ago. The Civil Rights Act was enacted into law during King's lifetime. He was killed 4 years later in 1968. So read over that news account in the New York Times of King's assassination. It's pretty riveting. Try to go back in time and imagine how you would have felt reading the newspaper that morning and learning about King's death. The final item that I posted is also optional. It's by a very good philosopher named Stephen Nathanson, and it's entitled Civil Disobedience. And it describes to you some of the philosophical issues that are raised by this concept of civil disobedience. When, if ever, is it permissible morally to disobey the law? When and why? Does it have to be done for a particular reason? Are certain kinds of disobedience disallowed? Is it ever permissible to engage in violent disobedience of the law? And what does violent mean? Does that mean physical harm to persons? Does it include damage or destruction to property? That sort of thing. So I debated whether to make that reading optional. I could well have required you to read it and then tested you on it. But I don't think we're going to have time to go over it, and it may not be fair of me to test you on it without having discussed it at all. So it's one of those items that I highly recommend that you read. It'll help you understand some of the issues that are being raised by King in his letter. Okay, having said all that, let me turn to my lecture notes, which really in this case is my illustrated guide to King's letter. And here's how we will proceed. We have three full class periods to cover this letter. I hope to get through it in those 3 class periods. So today I'd like to get about 1/3 of the way through it. And then on the second lecture this week, we'll try to do another 1/3. And then we'll wrap things up early next week. Probably on Monday, I'll record your lecture. And we'll try to wrap things up. Because remember, the exam will be the following Thursday, a week from this coming Thursday. So we need to get it all packed into 3 lectures. And I'm going to make a noble attempt to do that. So I got to keep on track. If I pause to make any additional comments, I'll have to discipline myself and keep them to the point. Keep from going off on digressions, which is what I'm doing right now. So let's get to it. Now, you should have printed out at least the following before you watch this video. This letter, this typescript version of King's letter, because I'm going to be reading from it paragraph by paragraph, and my illustrated guide to King's letter. That's 23 pages long. You should have printed that, and if you haven't read it, have it handy so that you can follow along when I read from it. Now, this is not ideal. In a classroom setting, in the past, I have asked for volunteers. I have asked for students to volunteer to read the next paragraph. And then I talk about it. We talk about it. But with this video format, it's a little difficult to do that. So I'm going to try to approximate the discussion by reading my comments after each paragraph. Okay, let's get to my illustrated guide. There's an introductory paragraph. Let's read it together. The numerals below, and if you look down on page 1, you'll see the numeral 1. If you turn to page 2, you'll see numeral 2. If you look at page 3, you'll see numerals 3 and 4. You may be wondering what those numerals refer to. They correspond to paragraphs in this version of King's letter. So you may want to number the paragraphs. You can see that I've done that in my copy. Let me hold it up. You see over here, right above my finger, I have the circled numeral 7. That's the 7th paragraph of this letter. So you may want to pause the video, assuming you've printed this out, go through and number the paragraphs. And I can tell you that the letter itself contains 46 paragraphs. All right, so my numerals in this illustrated guide correspond to those 46 paragraphs. Okay, continuing. This is called the ACM-HR version of King's letter. I told you earlier that there are many versions of this letter on the internet, and I'm using this one. What does that acronym stand for? It stands for Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. King wrote his famous letter on 16 April 1963, which is almost 59 years ago. Next month, it'll be 59 years since King wrote this letter. That day, the day he wrote the letter, happened to be 2 days after Easter. Easter that year fell on the 14th of April. This was King's 5th day of incarceration. So he had been in jail for 4 days already. This was day number 5 when he either started the letter or completed the letter, right? I don't know whether he wrote the letter in 1 day. He may have written it over a period of 2 or more days. But it was roughly 4 or 5 days into his incarceration in jail. King was in jail for a total of 8 days, from the 12th of April, which was 2 days before Easter, to the 20th of April, which was 6 days after Easter. Here's an interesting tidbit. King was bailed out of jail by someone who was famous in his own right, and that is Harry Belafonte. Harry Belafonte, and maybe some of you have heard of him. If not, you can look him up and read his Wikipedia page. Harry Belafonte, who's still alive, remarkably, he was born in 1927, and I checked the other day to see whether he's still alive, and apparently he is. He's 95 years old sometime this year, so he's quite old now. He was, at the time, and was for a long time, a singer, a songwriter, and an actor. He appeared in many movies. Harry Belafonte. Maybe if you look up some images of him, you'll recognize him from some movie you've seen. Harry Belafonte, who shared some of King's beliefs and who had money that he could use for this purpose, bailed him out of jail. It cost him $2,500. Now, if King showed up for his hearing, then the money would have been refunded to Belafonte. But when you post bail, you always take a risk that the person you're bailing out won't show up, and you will then lose your money. So Belafonte put up the money. Here is a photograph on the day of arrest, and it shows you from the left Fred Shuttlesworth, Ralph Abernathy, and Martin Luther King Jr. You can see what they're wearing. They're wearing kind of durable shirts with what looks like perhaps an undershirt underneath, a couple of them. King is carrying a jacket over his arm, and so this apparently was before they were arrested. Someone snapped a photograph of them as they were about to march. Okay, let's get started. Here's paragraph 1 of King's letter. I'm going to begin with the very top of the letter. It says at the top, Martin Luther King, Jr., Birmingham City Jail, April 16, 1963. Okay, so that's who wrote it and where it was written and when it was written. King then addresses the letter to the following individuals: Bishop C.C.J. Carpenter, Bishop Joseph A. Durick, Rabbi Milton L. Grafman. Notice he's Jewish, so these are not all Christian clergymen. Bishop Nolan B. Harmon, the Reverend George H. Murray, the Reverend Edward V. Ramage, and the Reverend Earl Stallings. Now, you'll notice there are only 7 names there, but in fact, there were 8 of them. In fact, I should have had this out, but let me go in and get my copy of the letter written by the clergyman and published in the newspaper, because I want to begin by reading that. Okay, here's my copy. This is what it looks like. It's posted on Canvas, so you may want to pause the video and go print it. So let's read this together before we get back to King's letter. This statement was published in the Birmingham News on the 13th of April, 1963. King was in jail when this was published. Now, the jailers would have let him read the local newspaper. He probably asked for it. And when he opened it up, he may have been surprised to see this letter. And if you'll look at the bottom of it, you'll see there are 8 names. 8 people signed it. The one King omitted is Bishop Paul Hardin. So he named 7 of them. He omitted, for some reason, to name the 8th one. So I'm going to refer to it as 8 clergymen from now on. Okay, this letter apparently was written on the 12th of April, the day King was arrested and jailed. Here's what they say. We, the undersigned clergymen, are among those who, in January, issued, quote, an appeal for law and order and common sense, unquote, in dealing with racial problems in Alabama. We expressed understanding that honest convictions in racial matters could properly be pursued in the courts, but urged that decisions of those courts should in the meantime be peacefully obeyed. So they're advocating that they're well aware of conflict and tension, and what they're saying is let the courts sort it out, right? Law and order. Follow the rule of law. We don't want violence. We don't want demonstrations. We don't want physical conflict. They're trying to tamp things down. Since that time, there had been some evidence of increased forbearance and a willingness to face facts. Responsible citizens have undertaken to work on various problems which cause racial friction and unrest. In Birmingham, recent public events have given indication that we all have opportunity for a new, constructive, and realistic approach to racial problems. By the way, you probably guessed that all 8 of these clergymen are white. Not one of them is black or African American. However, we're now confronted by a series of demonstrations by some of our Negro citizens, directed and led in part by outsiders, meaning people outside of Birmingham, maybe even people outside of Alabama, people who don't reside there. We recognize the natural impatience of people who feel that their hopes are slow in being realized, but we're convinced that these demonstrations are unwise and untimely. This is me talking now. As you will see when we get to King's letter, he spends a lot of his letter talking about this untimely, unwise claim and about being patient. He says, he's going to go on to say that black people have been patient for a long time, and there's never going to come a time when it's timely to make changes. And so King is impatient, and rightfully so, he thinks, rightly so. Okay, continuing. We agree rather with certain local Negro leadership, which has called for honest and open negotiation of racial issues in our area. And we believe this kind of facing of issues can best be accomplished by citizens of our own metropolitan area, white and Negro, meeting with their knowledge and experience of the local situation. All of us need to face that responsibility and find proper channels for its accomplishment. Again, King is going to address this, you'll see. The ministers, the clergy members are trying to limit these discussions to local citizenry, people who live there, who have a stake in the government and in the laws. These clergymen, they don't want outsiders like King coming into their city and causing trouble as they see it. Just as we formerly pointed out that, quote, hatred and violence have no sanction in our religious and political traditions, unquote, we also point out that such actions as incite to hatred and violence, however technically peaceful those actions may be, have not contributed to the resolution of our local problems. We do not believe that these days of new hope are days when extreme measures are justified in Birmingham. Now that's interesting because they're using the language of extremism to describe what King and his followers are doing and have done, which is nonviolent protest, marching down the street, for example, in solidarity with one another and with certain white citizens. It's almost incredible that these clergymen view that as extreme measures. And King, again, is going to talk about that in his letter. Who are the extremists, in other words? Is it him and his followers, or could it be the whites in Birmingham who keep saying, wait, this is untimely, be patient? All right, a couple more paragraphs and we'll be done. We commend the community as a whole, and the local news media and law enforcement in particular, on the calm manner in which these demonstrations have been handled. We urge the public to continue to show restraint should the demonstrations continue, and the law enforcement official to remain calm and continue to protect our city from violence. Now, King is going to have a field day with this paragraph. He's going to say, who is perpetrating the acts of violence? It's not me or my followers. We were not violent in any way. We may have broken the law, but we did so in a nonviolent, peaceful, calm way. The violence, King will say, was perpetrated by law enforcement officials who turned hoses on protesters and loosed their dogs on protesters. You'll see some images of that later. So King is saying, we didn't incite anybody to violence. We were ever so peaceful. Finally, the clergy members say, we further strongly urge our own Negro community to withdraw support from these demonstrations and to unite locally in working peacefully for a better Birmingham. When rights are consistently denied, a cause should be pressed in the courts and in negotiations among local leaders, and not in the streets. We appeal to both our white and Negro citizenry to observe the principles of law and order and common sense. Notice, the members of the clergy appear to be trying to drive a wedge between members of the black community, those who live locally and those who have come in from outside, like King. The hope, maybe it's a divide and conquer strategy, right? If we can divide the black community into two parts or more parts, then their effectiveness will dissipate. They will lose whatever solidarity and therefore whatever power they may have had working together. So it's an interesting letter or statement, isn't it? You can see that they probably approached the editor of the Birmingham News and said, look, we are 8 members of the clergy of different denominations. We hope by publishing this letter to tamp down tensions and explain why we think that the better solution is working through the legal system and reforming the laws rather than going out into the streets and demonstrating or protesting or parading. So I'm going to put this letter aside now. We will see when we read King's letter that he comes back again and again to discuss some of the things that are said in this letter. So now let me go back to King's letter as well as my comments thereon. Okay, first, notice that King addresses the letter to my dear fellow clergymen. And I'll say something about that in a moment, but let's read the first paragraph. King says, while confined here in the Birmingham City Jail, I came across your recent statement calling our present activities unwise and untimely. Notice he quoted from their statement. Seldom, if ever, do I pause to answer criticism of my work and ideas. If I sought to answer all of the criticisms that cross my desk, my secretaries would be engaged in little else in the course of the day, and I would have no time for constructive work. But since I feel that you are men of genuine goodwill, and your criticisms are sincerely set forth, I would like to answer your statement in what I hope will be patient and reasonable terms. All right, so that's King's first paragraph. I have some things to say about that now. And if we were in the classroom, of course, you could add some thoughts of your own. So here are my comments. I'm now reading from my handout. King, who was 34 years old when he wrote the letter, addressed, which may not be much older than you are, come to think of it. Some of you may be as old as 22 or 23 years old. Others of you might be older students. Maybe some of you are King's age, 34, or even older than that. But even if you're only 22 years old, you're only 12 years younger than King was when he wrote this letter. All right, King, who was 34 years old when he wrote the letter, addresses the 8 clergymen respectfully, which is a way of building rapport with them. His salutation or greeting is, quote, my dear fellow clergymen, unquote. Note the word fellow. King was himself a clergyman. He's the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He's emphasizing something that he and the other clergymen have in common before going on respectfully to discuss their differences. So that's interesting. King has found some common ground between them. We're all men of the faith, he's saying. So let's speak respectfully to one another and see what we can accomplish, and see what kinds of further agreements we can come to. Note the urgency of King's opening words. Quote, while confined here in the Birmingham City Jail, unquote. King's letter is not written with the detachment of a philosopher or a theologian. It is written by a particular person with particular concerns at a particular time and place. In fact, he tells you, I'm sitting in a jail cell. I'm writing this from my cell. I'm being confined against my will, without my permission. Imagine John Rawls, the famous Harvard philosopher. Imagine John Rawls opening his book entitled A Theory of Justice with the words, while seated here in my office on the campus of Harvard University, blah, blah, blah. Of course, you would never see a book open that way. Not a book of philosophy, anyway. You never see that. Maybe in the acknowledgments of the book, where you thank people, including your family, and so on. That tends to be a personal part of a book. But in the body of the book itself, you would never describe where you're writing and when you're writing it and why you're writing it. But King did. And that shows you that while King had philosophical training and was in many ways himself a philosopher, King was writing this letter not so much as a philosopher, but as a citizen, as a particular person situated in a particular time and place with particular concerns in mind. So it's not written with the detachment of a philosophical book or article. That's my point. King says that he seldom pauses to answer criticism. He says that if he answered criticism, it would take all or most of his and his secretary's time, and he would get nothing else done. Every act has opportunity costs. This is because life is short or finite. If I do X, whatever X may be, if I do X, I'm unable to do Y and Z. That's called the opportunity cost of doing X. Whenever you do one thing, you are thereby prevented from doing other things. So everything we do is costly in that sense. Some people, economists, have said that all costs, when you think about it, are opportunity costs. And that's because we have limited time, limited attention, limited energy, limited resources. So when we decide what to do, we are consciously or sometimes unconsciously choosing not to do other things. So King is saying, I have a lot to do, and my life is finite. Now, little did King know that his life he had only 5 more years to live. He was assassinated in April 1968, 5 years to the month after he wrote this letter. So King was well aware that time was his most precious commodity. And he is saying, I don't want to spend my precious time replying to criticism of me or of my work or of my writings. I have more important things to do. So continuing with my comments, King had important work to do and only so much time in which to do it. So he prioritized. Parenthesis. King did not know it, of course, but he had only 5 years to live. Parenthesis. Okay, I have a few more things to say about King's first paragraph. Some of my comments will be longer than King's paragraphs, like this one. Sometimes my comments will be quite short. So it all depends on how much there is to talk about in each paragraph. So let's move on. I'm on page 2 of my illustrated guide. King imputes good motives, not benign or bad motives, to the clergyman. He says that they are, quote, men of genuine goodwill, unquote, and that their criticisms of him are sincerely set forth. Imputing bad motives to others is cynicism. King was no cynic. King gave people the benefit of the doubt. King may have suspected an ulterior motive on the part of the clergyman. But he was going to put that out of his mind and give them the benefit of the doubt. I'm going to assume, he seems to be saying, I'm going to assume that your motives are good, that you really and sincerely want a better community, a community where there is justice and not just peace. I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. I'm not going to question your motives. I'm not going to impute bad motives to you. Well, that's something you ought to keep in mind, because there's a lot of bad faith in our society today. We're in some ways divided into warring camps, and each side so hates the other that they refuse to give them the benefit of the doubt. If you're a Democrat, for example, you may assume the worst of your Republican opponents. If you're a Republican, you may assume the worst of your Democratic opponents. It goes both ways. And that creates, as you can well imagine, and as you well know, it creates a lot of divisiveness. People, instead of trying to find common ground to discuss their differences, they push each other further apart by questioning each other's motives. You don't really want to do that for this reason. You want to do it for some other more sinister reason, people say. So King is trying to avoid all of that bad faith. He's imputing good motives to the clergymen, even if deep down he suspects that they might not have such pure, noble motives. King was no cynic. He assumed the best of others and gave them the benefit rather than the detriment of the doubt. You may view this as a form of flattery. You may think King is flattering them or trying to flatter them, but it's really just respect for his interlocutors. Now, that's a fancy word for the people you're talking to, your audience. He's showing respect for them. How would you feel if other people questioned your motives or impugned your character or integrity? I'm sure you would not like it. You would not feel good about it. So why would you do to others what you would not have them do to you? It's really, as I say here, an application of the golden rule. And I'm going to quote one of the Gospels of the Bible. In everything do to others as you would have them do to you, for this is the law and the prophets. Now, I could have quoted from the Quran. I could have quoted from the Old Testament. I could have quoted from Confucius. Almost every religious tradition has some form of the golden rule. I happen to pick the biblical, the New Testament version, but you could find such a golden rule elsewhere. King says that he's going to reply to the clergyman in patient and reasonable terms. I'm sorry, I hate when people do this, but it's easier for me to do that than to say, quote, patient and reasonable terms, unquote. So bear with me and try to grit your teeth and put up with that, as annoying as it is. King is trying to calm tensions, to tamp things down. His appeal is to reason, not emotion. He's acting like a philosopher. Here is King being arrested by police. And you can see that Ralph Abernathy, one of the two men who were depicted with King in the previous photograph, Abernathy is behind him. It looks like he's being roughed up by the police. Notice the pride in King's face. King is standing straight up with his head back. He's not resisting arrest in any way. He, I'm sure, knew that this would happen. He may have dressed accordingly so that while he was in jail, he would have a warm shirt and an undershirt to wear so he wouldn't get cold in the cell. It's only April. Maybe it's chilly in Birmingham at that time of year. So anyway, you can see a picture of what it was like when they were arrested. You see police officers swarming all over behind them. I don't know where Shuttlesworth is, Fred Shuttlesworth. He's obviously been arrested as well. He's probably behind the police officer who's behind Abernathy. Okay, so the plot thickens. We're going to work our way through the letter. I was telling my wife what I would be doing for the next 3 class periods, And it's interesting, it's not like the other parts of the course. Ultimately, we're going to focus on the philosophical aspects of King's letter. What is civil disobedience? Let's analyze the concept. Let's make some relevant distinctions between violent disobedience and nonviolent disobedience, things like that. We'll also be looking at King's argument in favor of nonviolent civil disobedience. And he has actually several arguments, one of which appeals to justice. So we need to ask, what is justice? What kinds of justice are there? So the philosophy will emerge as we go through his letter. And what I was telling my wife is I like this part of the course because it's not only philosophy, but it's law, it's religion, it is sociology, right? We're looking at some social movements like the civil rights movement, and it's also history. This is an important feature of American history, King's civil rights movement and his arrest and this famous letter. This is an historically significant document in American history that we are now reading together and discussing with one another. So again, the philosophy will emerge as we go along, but I hope you also learn some history, learn some basic facts about the law and about society. Okay, I'm going to go back now to King's second paragraph. Okay, you see how we're going to approach this? King says, I think I should give the reason for my being in Birmingham, since you have been influenced by the argument of, quote, outsiders coming in, unquote. I have the honor of serving as president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organization operating in every southern state with headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. We have some 85 affiliate organizations all across the South. All across the South. I thought that long dash was a hyphenation break. So let me start over. We have some 85 affiliate organizations all across the South, one being the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. And that is the organization that typed this up. You'll see on the cover it says, from ACMHR, and it's addressed to Joe Higginbotham of Birmingham. Now, I don't know why this was being sent to Joe Higginbotham or even who he is, but it was evidently typed up by King's organization, ACMHR. King continues, whenever necessary and possible, we share staff, educational and financial resources with our affiliates. Several months ago, our local affiliate here in Birmingham invited us to be on call to engage in a nonviolent direct action program if such were deemed necessary. We readily consented, and when the hour came, we lived up to our promises. So I am here, along with several members of my staff, because we were invited here. I'm here because I have basic organizational ties here. Now, let me read what I wrote and comment on this paragraph, and then maybe I'll have some additional things to say about it. Okay, I'm reading from the bottom of page 2 of my handout. The clergymen, as you know from reading their public statement, had expressed concern about outsiders coming in to Birmingham. King addresses this concern. He says that he was invited by the local affiliate of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, of which he was then president. The affiliate was ACMHR. Having accepted the invitation, he felt duty-bound to appear. Right? It would be morally questionable to accept an invitation and then not show up. Or it would be morally questionable to make a promise, if that's the way you view it, and break it. He calls this the keeping of a promise. Surely the clergyman would not want him to break a promise. In this paragraph, King is trying to establish the legitimacy of his presence in Birmingham. He's not a rabble-rouser or outside agitator. He has important business to conduct. And he has every legal right to be wherever he wants to be. It's a free country. King can travel to any city. He can go to Seattle, San Francisco, Des Moines, Iowa, Dallas, Texas, anywhere. He can go to Birmingham if he wants. It's a free country. Why does he have to justify being in Birmingham, after all? Here are King's police photographs, or what are often called mugshots. And you can see this is the day he was arrested. Shortly after the previous image was taken, he was taken to the police station and booked. And these are his police photographs. There's the side view and the front view. Notice he's looking calm. He fully expected that this would happen. He was prepared for it. He steeled himself for it. And he's got a, I don't know, when I look at this, he looks like he's dignified. He's accepting of his fate, calm, and so on. Paragraph 3, back to King. Moreover, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all, sorry, my notebook is slipping. I'm cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Let me say that again. I put the emphasis on the wrong word. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with the narrow, provincial, outside agitator idea. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider anywhere in this country. Now, I have a few things to say about this. A lot, in fact. I have just a few things to say about this. I'll have more to say about paragraph 4. So here we Okay, this is terrible. You're probably chuckling. I just read paragraph 4. I neglected paragraph 3. So let me go back and read paragraph 3. We'll come back. I won't reread paragraph 4 when we get to it, but we want to take them in order. Sorry about that. Paragraph 3. Beyond this, I'm in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as the 8th century prophets left their little villages and carried their "Thus saith the Lord" far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns, and just as the Apostle Paul left his little village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to practically every hamlet and city of the Greco-Roman world, I too am compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my particular hometown. Like Paul, I must constantly respond to the Macedonian call for aid. Okay, now let's read what I wrote about paragraph 3. King gives another and more important reason for being in Birmingham. Quote, I'm in Birmingham because injustice is here, unquote. He alludes to or mentions several Christian prophets who went about in the world spreading the gospel. Notice, King is situating himself in Christian lore and thereby appealing to the religious faith of the clergymen. The gospel is not that preached by Jesus, but the gospel of freedom. So whereas the people he mentions were preaching the gospel of Jesus, King is preaching a different gospel, the gospel of freedom. But he is situating himself in the same Christian tradition. It's just that what he is preaching is different. King, we might say, is a proselytizer or missionary in the grand Christian tradition. Like the Apostle Paul, he's answering a call for aid. So lots going on in that fairly short paragraph. Now, back to paragraph 4. I'm not going to read it again because I just did. I took it out of order. But let's read what I wrote about it. I have quite a bit to say. Paragraph 4. King continues to justify his presence in Birmingham. He says that all communities and states are interrelated. Everyone is tied in a single garment of destiny. He cannot sit idly by as wrongs are committed. Quote, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, unquote. Note King's use of metaphor. He speaks of a network, a garment of people being insiders and outsiders. King, like Abraham Lincoln, was adept at coining memorable phrases, such as, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. You may have heard that. Now you know where it comes from. And also, King wrote, whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Now, just to show you, just to situate King in the history of American rhetoric, listen to some of the things Lincoln wrote. You've probably heard many or most of these, maybe all of them. Lincoln supposedly uttered the following during the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And I say supposedly because some people believe that he uttered these. There are reports that he said this. Other people doubt it. You can fool some of the people all of the time, and all of the people some of the time, but you cannot fool all of the people all of the time. So Lincoln had a way of making these pithy statements. Now, the rest of these are pretty clearly attributable to Lincoln. That one was a little bit doubtful. Okay, top of page 4 of my notes. Lincoln said in June 1858, while he was campaigning for the Senate in Illinois, he gave an address and he said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. He was alluding to the rift about slavery, the slave-owning South and the non-slave-owning North. A house divided against itself cannot stand. Now, he was actually taking that from the Bible, or paraphrasing the Bible. Here is a quotation from Mark, the book of Mark in the Bible. And if a house is divided against itself, the house will not be able to stand. That's from the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible, Mark 3:25. So Lincoln was steeped in the literature of the Bible. He very often quoted from the Bible. He had read the Bible thoroughly, probably many times growing up, and he resorted to it. I'm reading the history of the Civil War right now, and just today I read that while discussing a battle with his cabinet, he pulled out his Bible and he found a passage in the book of Samuel, and he read it aloud in his cabinet meeting. So Lincoln was able to go immediately to the proper part of the Bible for the quotation that he was seeking. So many of his statements allude to biblical passages, and that one does. All right, Lincoln wrote the following and gave the following as an address after his first election. This is March 1861. Lincoln has just been elected president for the first time. He was elected twice. This is the first inaugural address. And this is the closing line. Lincoln said, "We are not enemies." Now he's addressing the South, the Southern people who are just about to start seceding from the Union. A month later, the shots were fired at Fort Sumter, and the South, many of the Southern states, began to secede from the Union, and that was the start of war. Lincoln was pleading in this inaugural address to the Southerners to stay in the Union. Don't secede, please. Lincoln said, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic chords of memory will swell when again touched, as surely they will be by the better angels of our nature." Now, I have chills. When I read some of these famous quotations from Lincoln, it gives me chills. These are among the most famous lines ever spoken in this country's history. Here is Lincoln again, the closing line of the Gettysburg Address, which is during the Civil War. He went to the Gettysburg battlefield where a great battle had been fought, and tens of thousands of soldiers on both sides had perished. It was a bloodbath. And the field was being set aside as a national cemetery. And Lincoln was invited to go there and speak to the assembled crowd. Lincoln's speech was quite short. It's called the Gettysburg Address. And here's what he said, the final line. He used the famous phrase, government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. And I'm sure you've heard that phrase. And finally, Lincoln said the following in March 1865, only 1 month before he was assassinated. This is the closing line of his second inaugural address. Lincoln, the war is almost over. Lee would surrender to Grant 1 month later at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. So the writing was on the wall. Lincoln knew that the great and terrible war, with all of its loss of life and expenditure and suffering, Lincoln knew the war was almost over. And he had been reelected a few months earlier, November 1864. And here's what he wrote, the closing line. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. So he's trying to heal up the wounds that have been suffered, not just physical wounds, but the emotional wounds of a 4-year war, which took a terrible toll in life and treasure. So I quote Lincoln a few times here just to show you how memorable some of his phrases are. And King, I would put in the same class as Lincoln. My own view is that Lincoln and King are the two greatest orators this country has ever produced. King and Lincoln. All right, paragraph 5, back to King's letter. I'll try to stay on track. I skipped a paragraph a moment ago. I don't know how that happened. Paragraph 5, you, my fellow clergymen, deplore the demonstrations that are presently taking place in Birmingham. But I'm sorry that your statement did not express a similar concern for the conditions that brought the demonstrations into being. I am sure that each of you would want to go beyond the superficial social analyst who looks merely at effects and does not grapple with underlying causes. I would not hesitate to say that it is unfortunate that so-called demonstrations are taking place in Birmingham at this time. But I would say in more emphatic terms that it's even more unfortunate that the white power structure of this city left the Negro community with no other alternative. Notice he used that phrase, the white power structure. I think I used it earlier today, and I'm drawing it from the words of King that he used in this letter. So he views the structure of the city government, and he views it as a structure, and it's a structure that wields power, and that power happens to be wielded by white people. So he calls it the white power structure. Blacks are excluded from that structure. There are no black members of the government. And King thinks the reason for that is injustice, right? Blacks are being excluded from the political process and therefore from lawmaking. And that helps perpetuate an injustice where you have the whites up here and the black citizens down here. So it's not a relation of equality where white and black citizens are on a par with one another. It's a hierarchy. Whites on top, blacks at the bottom. King calls that the white power structure. So let's read what I wrote about paragraph 5. King, in this paragraph, accuses the clergymen of inconsistency. He says that they deplore the demonstrations or protests taking place in Birmingham, but not the conditions that brought the demonstrations into being. Another way to put this is that the clergymen have a double standard. One standard for King and his followers, another for those who run the city, which he calls the white power structure. There are two types of social analysis, shallow and deep. A shallow analysis looks only at effects. A deep analysis looks at the underlying causes. Why would people risk their lives, health, and well-being to protest conditions in Birmingham? What is the source or basis of the injustice of which they complain? King ends the paragraph by saying that Birmingham city officials left the Negro community with no other alternative than to demonstrate. In other words, demonstration for King is a last resort. He would prefer that changes be made in a lawful, orderly way by working through the system or within the system. But as King will go on to explain, that's not likely to happen. There are structural impediments to change in Birmingham and elsewhere in the South. So something has to happen to change that. Something perhaps lawless, some kind of disobedience, civil disobedience is going to have to be used to make changes. And that's unfortunate. It would be better, it would be preferable if we didn't have to resort to that, King seems to be saying. The situation, in his view, had become desperate. We've reached that last resort moment. Here's King in his jail cell. You can see, I don't know which day this was taken. He spent a total of 8 days in the cell, but that's what it was like, day after day after day. He's got bars in front of him. I don't know what he can see through the bars. Maybe cells on the other side of the hall. I don't know. Possibly outside, maybe you can see trees and grass through a window. I don't know. But that's King contemplating, thinking in the cell. There wasn't much else to do. He could scribble on the margins of a newspaper that was brought into him. But when the letter was done, he had nothing to do but think. Sit there and think. Okay, we're a little over an hour in. I'm probably going to need an hour and 20 minutes 3 times. And so I'll stop in 18 minutes, however far we get. But let's make some progress. Paragraph 6 from King's letter. In any nonviolent campaign, there are 4 basic steps. Now already you're thinking, Keith will probably ask about this on the exam, either in a true-false question or a multiple choice question. So this is one of those things where it's cut and dried, and I may well ask you about it. 4 basic steps in any nonviolent campaign. Number 1, collection of the facts to determine whether injustices are alive. Okay? Gather information. Get the facts. Don't act out of ignorance. Don't leap to conclusions about what's going on or what causes it. Gather the facts patiently, painstakingly, methodically. When that's done, go on to step 2, negotiation. When you enter the negotiation with the white power structure, you need to have the facts at your disposal. You may find that the people on the other side of the table negotiating with you don't have the facts. You may disagree about what the facts are, but you've at least done your homework, and you can present the other side with what you take to be the facts in the hope that they will come to agree that those are the facts. 3, self-purification. Now, King will explain what that's all about later, but let me give you an idea. If you're in a nonviolent campaign, you have to teach your followers who are going to be involved how to conduct themselves. They themselves must be pure or purified. They must learn not to strike back when they're arrested or abused in any way. They must learn how to conduct themselves in a certain way. That's part of the plan, King is saying. It's very important. And he did have meetings with his followers. And he said to them, can you, if you are struck by a police officer, can you resist the temptation to strike back? And if he saw any hesitation, he said, I'm sorry, you can't participate in this, because if even one person resists arrest, that will give the police an excuse to abuse and violate all of us. And we don't want that, right? We've got to be disciplined and in control of our emotions. King is calling that self-purification. And finally, fourth step, direct action. Now, I'm going to hold off on that. King's going to explain direct action. It involves things like demonstrations, sit-ins, marches, other forms of protest, and so on. King says, we've gone through all of these steps in Birmingham. So he announces the 4 steps and says, we've already done all 4. We're ready. There can be no gainsaying, which is a fancy way of saying denying. There can be no denying of the fact, no denial of the fact that racial injustice engulfs this community, meaning Birmingham. Birmingham is probably the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. Its ugly record of police brutality is known in every section of this country. Its unjust treatment of Negroes in the courts is a notorious reality. There have been more unsolved bombings of Negro homes and churches in Birmingham than any city in this nation. These are the hard, brutal, and unbelievable facts. On the basis of these conditions, Negro leaders sought to negotiate with the city fathers. That would be the so-called white power structure. But the political leaders consistently refused to engage in good faith negotiation. Okay, that's the end of paragraph 6. My comments. King lays out 4 basic steps of a nonviolent campaign, and I simply quote him. He says that he and his followers have gone through all of these steps. As for the first step, collection of facts, it is clear that, quote, racial injustice engulfs this community. Negroes are subject to segregation, police brutality, and injustice in the courts. Their homes and churches have been bombed. Negro leaders tried to negotiate with the city fathers, but were denied even the opportunity to engage in good faith negotiation. The city fathers wouldn't even sit down and talk with them. King is starting to make the case for the moral permissibility of civil disobedience. He's starting to make the case, the argument. Okay? He's laying the groundwork for the protests, the demonstrations that he believes are justified, necessary and justified. Okay, paragraph 7. Now this is one of King's longer paragraphs, so let's get started. Then came the opportunity last September to talk with some of the leaders of the economic community. Now, notice, economic community, not necessarily political or legal community. He's talking about people who own businesses. In these negotiating sessions, certain promises were made by the merchants, such as the promise to remove the humiliating racial signs from the stores. On the basis of these promises, Reverend Shuttlesworth, that's Fred Shuttlesworth, he was in the first one of the early pictures I showed you. Reverend Shuttlesworth and the leaders of the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights agreed to call a moratorium on any type of demonstrations. As the weeks and months unfolded, we realized that we were the victims of a broken promise. In other words, they promised they would do something, and we took us a while, but we realized they broke the promise. You might even say they lied to us. The signs that they promised to remove remained. Like so many experiences of the past, we were confronted with blasted hopes, and the dark shadow of a deep disappointment settled upon us. So we had no alternative except that of preparing for direct action, whereby we would present our very bodies as a means of laying our case before the conscience of the local and national community. We were not unmindful of the difficulties involved. So we decided to go through a process of self-purification. We started having workshops on nonviolence and repeatedly asked ourselves the questions, quote, are you able to accept blows without retaliating, unquote? And another quotation, are you able to endure the ordeals of jail? We decided to set our direct action program around the Easter season, realizing that with the exception of Christmas, this was the largest shopping period of the year. Knowing that a strong withdrawal program, and what he means is economic withdrawal, knowing that a strong economic withdrawal program would be the byproduct of direct action, we felt that this was the best time to bring pressure on the merchants for the needed changes. In other words, hurt them where it hurts the most. The Easter season was a time of expenditure of money by the Black community at these shops. And King is trying to convey to the merchants that we have power and you need to sit down and negotiate with us in good faith, because if we boycott your establishments, it will cost you a great deal of money. Your profits will be much lower. And for some of you, perhaps you'll have to go out of business. So King and his followers chose the Easter season for a reason. They wanted to economically harm the merchants. And the Easter season would be the time to inflict the greatest harm on them. Then it occurred to us that the March election was ahead, and so we speedily decided to postpone action until after Election Day. Now, I'll comment on that election in a moment. When we discovered that Mr. Connor was in the runoff, we decided again to postpone action so that the demonstrations could not be used to cloud the issues. At this time, we agreed to begin our nonviolent witness the day after the runoff. Now, I've done my research. Let me explain what's going on here. Paragraph 7 in my notes. In September 1962, which is roughly 8 months earlier, King and his followers finally got an opportunity, quote, to talk with some of the leaders of the economic community, unquote. These would have been white merchants. To prevent a boycott of their establishments by members of the Black community, the merchants promised to remove humiliating racial signs from their stores. And here are some examples of those signs that I found on the internet and I've posted for you. You may never have seen such a thing, but King and his followers saw them every day in various business establishments in Birmingham and elsewhere in the South. The first sign says, "No dogs, Negroes, Mexicans." Imagine seeing that on the door of a business that you would like to patronize. And suppose you are a Negro or a Mexican. And by the way, notice that King, throughout this essay, this letter, uses the word Negro or Negroes. That was in common use at the time. It's disfavored now, but for historical accuracy, that's what we're actually uttering the word. Later in this letter, King will use an even more powerful word, a slur or epithet, and I think I found 2 occurrences of that word in here. I probably won't utter the word. I could, but some people are offended by the mere utterance of the word. So while it's in King's letter, I won't be uttering it in my lectures or discussions. The second sign says restrooms, white and colored, with arrows going in each direction. So there were segregated restroom facilities, one for white people, one for what are called colored people. And third, this one obviously would appear in a bus or subway or something, some public conveyance. It says colored, seated in rear. So if you get on a public bus, you have to go to the rear if you're Black. If you're white, you can sit anywhere you want, but only the back is allowed for colored people. Okay, at the bottom of page 5. Alas, King says, the promises were broken, the signs remained. King says that this blasted their hopes. He described the feeling with a stirring metaphor. Quote, The dark shadow of a deep disappointment settled upon us, unquote. He and his followers were left with, quote, no alternative except that of preparing for direct action. Their objective was to disobey, meaning to break the law, non-violently. I italicized that word. It's very important that these acts of disobedience be conducted in a non-violent way. And the king and his followers were to accept the ensuing punishment, the punishment that they knew would come. This would, quote, lay our case before the conscience of the local and national community. Now, right there, King is explaining the audience for this, the ultimate purpose. He wants to appeal to the consciences of not only the people in Birmingham, who may be well aware of what has been happening to black citizens, but to the people all over the United States, including in the North, people who may not know what life is like for black citizens in the South. King wants to get in the national news. He wants to strike up a conversation across the nation. Okay, let's continue. Note that King has a national audience in mind. He knew that the demonstrations would be televised across the country. He and his followers underwent a process of self-purification. They knew that they would be brutalized by police. The natural temptation when being mishandled by authorities, or anyone else for that matter, would be to fight back. But they had to resist the temptation to do so. They dressed in suits and ties, or other neat, clean apparel, and acted like gentlemen or women. King decided that the Easter season would be the best time to demonstrate, since it was, quote, the largest shopping period of the year, unquote. Remember, Easter that year was on the 14th of April. He postponed the demonstrations, however, until after the Birmingham mayoral election. And I can tell you the two people running for mayor, both white people, were Albert Boutwell and a man named Theophilus Eugene Bull Connor. He was called Bull Connor. There was an election coming up, it just so happened, in Birmingham for mayor. And Boutwell and Connor were running against one another. King says he postponed the demonstration until after that election out of respect for the political process. He didn't want to cloud the issues. So let's let the political process work. Now, Boutwell was considered a more moderate candidate than Connor. So it may be that King was hoping that Boutwell would be elected rather than Connor. So maybe it looked to King as though Boutwell was going to win. So why cloud the issue? Just back off, let the election occur. Maybe Boutwell will be elected. He may be more inclined to negotiate than Connor would. Okay, paragraph 8. It's short. King says, this reveals that we did not move irresponsibly into direct action. We too wanted to see Mr. Connor defeated. So we went through postponement after postponement to aid in this community need. After this, we felt that direct action could be delayed no longer. Here's my short comment. King says that postponing the demonstration until after the election shows that he acted responsibly. He did not rush into direct action. Although Boutwell was as much a segregationist as Connor, King and his followers wanted to see Connor defeated, and he was. However, Connor remained in office as, get this, Commissioner of Public Safety. In other words, he was the local sheriff. He was he remained in office as the sheriff. He was trying to be elected mayor. He was defeated, but he still had this office. And that allowed him to play a role in arresting King and his followers. Finally, with the election behind them, it was time to act. Okay, let's do one more paragraph. I know it's almost an hour and 20 minutes, but I want to, I think if we can get through paragraph 9, then we'll be on our way to finishing the whole letter in the next 2 class periods. So indulge me, bear with me, here we go. King says, you may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, etc.? Isn't negotiation a better path? He says, you are exactly right. Remember, he's talking to the 8 clergymen. You're exactly right in your call for negotiation. Indeed, this is the purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and establish such creative tension that a community that has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. I just referred, King says, to the creation of tension as a part of the work of the nonviolent resistor. This may sound rather shocking, but I must confess that I am not afraid of the word tension. I have earnestly worked and preached against violent tension, but there's a type of constructive, nonviolent tension that is necessary for growth. Just as Socrates felt that it was necessary to create a tension in the mind so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal, we must see the need of having nonviolent gadflies to create the kind of tension in society that will help men to rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. So the purpose of the direct action is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. In other words, it's a means to an end. We, therefore, concur with you in your call for negotiation. Too long has our beloved Southland been bogged, I think he means bogged down. Too long has our beloved Southland been bogged down in the tragic attempt to live in monologue rather than in dialogue. Mono means one. So a monologue is where someone is talking to himself or herself. It's one person doing all the talking. Dialogue is 2 or more people talking to each other in a conversation or in a dialogue. So, for the rest, just to end today, let's read what I wrote about paragraph 9. This is the paragraph in which King lays out his strategy. He calls it, quote, nonviolent direct action, unquote. It consists of sit-ins, where a group of people go into a restaurant where they're trespassing. In other words, there's a sign that says no blacks or no coloreds allowed, but they, being black or colored, go in anyway and take a seat at the counter. Okay, that's called a sit-in. They knew that the proprietor would ask them to leave. They would refuse to do so. They would simply sit there. The proprietor would then call the police. The police would come and remove them from the premises because they're trespassing. That's called a sit-in. It consists of sit-ins, marches, protests, boycotts, and demonstrations. The goal of direct action is, quote, to create such a crisis and establish such creative tension that a community that has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue, unquote. Note that the goal is negotiation. If the so-called white power structure will not negotiate of its own accord, i.e. voluntarily, it will be forced by public opinion to do so. King is trying to force them to negotiate, because otherwise they wouldn't. As King explains, direct action, quote, seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored, unquote. Many people believe that tension is a bad thing, but King says that he's not afraid of the word or that to which the word refers. He's not afraid of the word, tension, and he's not afraid of the thing, tension. Indeed, he says, constructive nonviolent tension is necessary for growth. King opposes destructive or violent tension and supports constructive nonviolent tension. So not all tension is the same. Some tension is good tension, and that would be the nonviolent kind that is designed to be used constructively to build something valuable. And then there's the bad tension, which is destructive, which is designed to destroy things rather than create things. And that is the that's the violent kind. So you have, once again, you have good tension, which is constructive and nonviolent, and you have bad tension, which is destructive and violent. So King is making an important philosophical distinction, which he can then use to make his argument. Okay, one more paragraph, page 7 of my notes. In the second half of the paragraph, King mentions Socrates, the Greek philosopher who devoted his later years to discussing philosophical issues with Athenian citizens. That is, they're from Athens, Greece, particularly young men of privilege. Socrates was a provocateur, or a gadfly, and was eventually put to death following a trial for corrupting the morals of Athenian youth. King implies that he, like Socrates, is a gadfly, a provocateur. He is annoying to the white power structure, and he creates tension. But this tension is, quote, necessary so that individuals may rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal, unquote. Now, King is alluding here to Plato's cave. Plato was a student of Socrates. Plato wrote many dialogues in which Socrates, his beloved teacher, figured as a character. King's alluding here to Plato's cave, which you can read about on Wikipedia if you want, under the heading Allegory of the Cave. And I add that Plato was a student of Socrates. So I'll leave it to you. If you want to learn more about this allegory of the cave, you can read it on Wikipedia as well as other places. Note the many metaphors in this paragraph. We've got bondage, right? People being bound so that they can't move. Bondage, gadflies. From the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. Lots of metaphors, lots of figurative language. Near the end of the paragraph, King refers to our beloved Southland. He's appealing to the regional loyalties of his audience and trying thereby to find common ground between them. That's interesting, isn't it? We saw earlier that he's trying to find common ground with the 8 clergymen on the basis of religion. Look, we're all Christians. We're all ministers of the same faith. That's something important that we have in common. Let's try to build on that. He is now appealing to them as Southerners. King is saying, I was born and grew up in the South. It's my beloved homeland. He calls it our beloved Southland. We love the South. We love everything about it, the culture, the weather, the history. Although some of the history is ugly, King still loves it in spite of that. Right? This is my home. I have roots here. My family was born here. My kids were born here. He's trying to appeal to them as Southerners, fellow Southerners. We may be different in terms of our skin color or race, but we're fellow Southerners. Let's use that commonality to build other things, to build a structure of trust and goodwill. And I put a picture of Socrates in discussion with 2 young Athenians in there. So notice, Socrates is considered one of the great philosophers of all time. Some people consider him the model philosopher. Even though, so far as we know, Socrates never wrote anything, we feel as though we know him because of what Plato wrote about him and other people wrote about him. Socrates was willing to die for his philosophy. You could say he was a martyr for philosophy. He refused to obey the Athenian authorities, who told him basically, cease and desist these philosophical discussions with our young people. They're becoming radicalized. They're thinking too much. They're neglecting their duties. How dare you corrupt them? Now, Socrates didn't view it as corrupting them. He thought he was educating them. He was teaching them to be critical thinkers about themselves and their own society and their laws and their government. So Socrates was killed for doing philosophy, to put it very starkly. And King is alluding to Socrates. He's lumping himself in with Socrates. Maybe King had a premonition of his own death. King may have saw himself as risking his life or health or well-being for the sake of a greater good. For Socrates, that greater good was philosophy. For King, it was justice, racial justice. So I thought it would be interesting for you to see an image, a famous image of Socrates in a very pastoral scene, having philosophical discussions with two young Athenians. Okay, sorry I kept you a few minutes late. We're an hour and a half in. At some point in the semester, I'll try to make up those few extra minutes. I don't like to go more than 120 because that's what we would have in the classroom. But I feel good about our progress. We've gone through paragraph 9, plus a lot of introductory stuff today. And we still have, 37 paragraphs to cover. But some of them will go quickly. In fact, I have comments on several of King's paragraphs lumped together. So we'll just see how it goes. We have 2 more days on King. We'll get as far as we can later this week in my second lecture, and then we'll try to complete things next week before the exam. So I hope you enjoyed that. You've got a nice mixture today of philosophy, history, law, society, and religion. It's a fascinating story, and I always love teaching this famous letter. Okay, we'll see you next time.